I'd been hiking the trails near Pine Ridge for years, always chasing quiet corners of the forest where the sunlight barely touched the ground. That morning, the air was thick with mist, the kind that clings to your clothes and makes every sound seem muffled, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I had my camera slung around my neck, lens focused on capturing deer or foxes or the occasional hawk that nested high above. But what I saw first didn't fit any of the animals I expected. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement just beyond the tree line. At first, I assumed it was a deer grazing, but the shape was different. Too upright, too deliberate. When I focused, nothing was there. Just a wavering shadow and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I moved closer, careful not to make too much noise, but it vanished, leaving only the damp smell of earth and moss. My stomach tightened, a mix of curiosity and unease pulling me deeper into the woods. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a hiker just ahead, or my imagination playing tricks with the morning fog. But then it happened again. A flash of long hair tangled with twigs, eyes glinting briefly in the dappled sunlight before disappearing behind a trunk. My camera hung useless around my neck. I tried to snap a picture, but the moment passed before I could focus. Over the next hour, I kept catching glimpses, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind. There was a pattern to the appearances, subtle and deliberate, like the forest had set a rhythm for me to follow, though I didn't understand why. Each time I saw the figure, the hairs on my neck stood on end. It wasn't moving like an animal, and it wasn't like any human I'd ever seen on these trails. As the hours passed, the sunlight waned and the forest darkened, the mist thickening into a creeping fog that swallowed the path behind me. I realized then that I couldn't retrace my steps. Every tree, every branch looked the same in the gloom, and every shadow seemed to shift just as I glanced toward it. The air felt alive, heavy and watchful, and the faint rustling of leaves or snapping of twigs became unbearable, each sound echoing in my chest like a warning. I began to feel the forest itself pressing in on me, making me doubt my senses. I wasn't lost exactly. I knew the general direction, but the trails twisted and looped in ways I didn't remember. It was as if the forest had changed while I wasn't looking. By late afternoon, I stumbled onto a faint trail I hadn't noticed before. Relief was immediate, but it was short-lived. I barely had a chance to think when a shadow darted across the path in front of me. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I froze, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't move. I couldn't look away either. The figure was fleeting, disappearing into the thickening fog, yet it left a weight in the air, like someone had pressed their presence onto the forest around me. I wanted to call out, to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. There was no human voice to reply, only the wind weaving through the pines, carrying with it an eerie, almost intentional whisper that seemed to echo faintly from every direction. Night fell, sudden and dark, and with it, a silence so complete it felt unnatural. The forest no longer seemed empty. I could hear the faintest crack of branches, soft movement just out of sight, and the occasional rustle of leaves that didn't match the wind. Every time I tried to get a sense of where I was, the shadows shifted, and I could feel eyes on me. Watching, waiting, judging. The hair on my arms stood on end, and each step I took felt loud enough to wake the entire ridge. I tried to keep moving, following what I hoped was a trail leading down to the main path, but the fog made everything indistinct, every tree and boulder blending into one another. Hours seemed to pass, though it could have been minutes. I lost all sense of time, stumbling over roots and rocks, twisting my ankle more than once, but I didn't dare stop. The forest felt alive, each movement deliberate, as though it had learned my patterns and was mirroring them just out of reach. Once, I thought I caught a glimpse of a face, pale and gaunt, peering from behind a clump of bushes. I blinked and it was gone. Then came the smell, damp earth, sweat, something metallic. It lingered in the air, thick and oppressive, like a reminder that I was not alone. Eventually, I found a faint clearing, moonlight filtering through the high branches just enough to guide my steps. I thought maybe I had escaped, that I had finally broken free from whatever was trailing me. But then I heard it, a whisper, soft and almost indecipherable, carried on the wind, close enough that it made my skin crawl. I turned quickly, scanning the shadows, but nothing moved. Not even a rabbit or bird. just empty darkness and the lingering sense that something had been inches away from me. I quickened my pace, heart racing, but the whispers didn't stop. They came from all around, from above, below, and behind. Hours later, when I finally stumbled onto a faint logging road that led back to the main trailhead, I thought I was safe. The mist had lifted slightly, and the forest seemed still. I stopped to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what I had seen. But even then, I knew I hadn't really left. Something from those woods had imprinted itself on me, a quiet dread that I carried with each step, a feeling that I was being watched even when I was miles away. I've returned to Pine Ridge since then, though I never follow the same trails. The forest looks the same on the surface, but I know better. Beneath the quiet canopy, the shadows linger, patient, deliberate, waiting for someone careless enough to step off the familiar path. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the faintest rustle in the trees, as if the ridge itself remembers me. I'd been walking an isolated trail in the Appalachians that morning, the kind of path most hikers avoided, where the canopy closed in tight enough that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. The air was damp and cool, the smell of wet pine and decaying leaves thick around me, and at first everything felt ordinary. The crunch of my boots against the mossy ground, birds calling faintly from somewhere above, the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush. But then I felt it, a shift in the air, a weight pressing on my shoulders that had nothing to do with my pack. I laughed quietly, shaking my head. Probably just nerves, I told myself. The forest has a way of making you imagine things when you're alone, hours from the nearest road. I kept moving, telling myself it was nothing. That's when I saw them. Eyes, barely visible between the dense branches, unblinking and patient. I froze, heart thudding painfully in my chest. They weren't the round, reflective eyes of a deer, nor the quick, darting gaze of a fox. These were human-like, but something about them was off. Patient, calculating. I felt my skin prickle, every instinct screaming at me that I was being watched, studied even. I dared not move for what felt like minutes, trying to convince myself it was a trick of light, that the shadows had somehow formed a face in the branches. But when I shifted my weight, they didn't vanish. They stayed, observing. A sudden snap of a twig behind me made me jump. My pulse spiked as I swung around, expecting to see a hiker, a deer, anything familiar, but nothing moved. The forest seemed impossibly quiet now, every rustle magnified. My pace quickened, each step deliberate but careful, ears straining for any sound that could explain the feeling of eyes on me. I tried doubling back, retracing my steps along the narrow trail, but the snapping of twigs followed me, keeping pace. Every turn, every curve of the path seemed to bring the same eerie sensation. I was not alone. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was shadowing me, patient, silent, never revealing itself fully. I reached a small clearing, the ferns tall and dense, curling like green fingers over the damp earth. That's when I glimpsed a figure crouched low, almost hidden. The posture was deliberate, silent, the outline blending perfectly with the undergrowth. I caught the faintest movement, just enough to know it was watching me, waiting for something. I froze in place, feeling suddenly exposed, vulnerable. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, the breeze stilled, the birds silent. I could feel it, the weight of its gaze pressing on me, studying, assessing, as if I were an intruder in a world I didn't belong in. Every instinct I had screamed to run, but there was a part of me that wanted to see, to understand. I took a hesitant step back, then another, and that's when I realized the snapping of twigs had stopped, replaced by a faint rustle that seemed to echo behind me. I spun in a slow circle, trying to catch a glimpse of any movement, but the clearing looked empty. And yet, the feeling didn't leave. The eyes were gone, at least for the moment, but I knew they were still there, somewhere in the shadows, watching. I quickened my pace, moving downhill toward the narrow gravel road that marked the edge of the forest. The path twisted and narrowed, roots curling like gnarled fingers across the trail. I stumbled more than once, my boots slipping in the mud, but I didn't dare stop to catch my breath. Every sense was on edge. I thought I heard whispers, almost imperceptible, carried by the wind, but when I paused, the forest returned only silence. The moments stretched on endlessly, each step echoing in my mind louder than it did in the forest. Somewhere along the trail, I felt a sudden chill brush past me, like someone had exhaled close to my neck. I spun, but there was nothing. No figure, no rustling, only the dense, dark trees leaning inward, blocking the waning sunlight. My breathing came fast now, shallow, my hands trembling as I gripped my camera strap for comfort. I wanted to tell myself I was imagining it all, that isolation and exhaustion were playing tricks, but deep down I knew better. I had seen the eyes and I had felt the presence, silent, patient, and entirely alien. The road finally came into view, a narrow stretch of gravel cutting through the forest. Relief washed over me, but even as I reached it, I kept glancing back. Every shadow among the trees seemed to flicker with movement, and every rustle in the leaves made me jump. I told myself it was just the wind, that nothing could survive so quietly in the wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, keeping pace until the last possible moment. I reached my truck as twilight fell, the forest behind me swallowing every trace of my passage. My hands were numb, my heart still racing, and the air tasted metallic in my mouth from the sudden panic. I sat there for a long time, engine off, staring into the shadowed forest, expecting, hoping to see nothing. And yet, I wanted to see something. I wanted confirmation, some understanding of what had been watching me, just beyond the canopy. But the road was empty. Only the quiet remained, heavy and watchful, as if the forest itself remembered me. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the memory. The shape of those eyes, patient and unblinking, the crouched figure blending perfectly with the ferns, the feeling of being followed without sound, without warning, it lingers. When I close my eyes, I see that clearing, the muted green of the ferns, the shadows that never move but are always there. I've returned to Pine Ridge since that day, but only on well-traveled trails in daylight, never alone. I know better now. The forest keeps its secrets, and sometimes it watches. And I've learned the hard way that the forest doesn't forget. I'd walked that trail near the hollow countless times over the years, enough that I could navigate it blindfolded, or so I thought. The path had always been quiet in the late afternoon, the kind of solitude that makes a forest feel almost like home. But that day, everything felt off. The air was heavier than I remembered, thick with an almost tangible tension that pressed against my chest. Even before I saw anything, I felt it, a weight, a gaze, though there was no one in sight. It was subtle at first, like the brush of a cold hand against your spine, something that made every nerve coil and tighten. As I walked closer to the hollow, I thought I heard voices. Not distinct words, just faint, murmuring sounds that seemed to rise and fall with the breeze. I stopped immediately, straining to hear, but the forest fell silent as if it had swallowed the noise whole. My ears caught only the normal creaks and groans of trees in the wind, but the sensation of being watched didn't fade. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my vision, fleeting shapes just beyond the reach of my focus. Every instinct told me to turn back, to leave before curiosity trapped me, but something compelled me forward, and the path itself seemed to guide me deeper. It was then that I noticed it. The hollow didn't sit quietly as it usually did. Shapes moved just beyond the edge of the trees, crouched low, hidden by ferns and brambles. Their movements were deliberate, careful, almost imperceptible unless you were paying attention, and I suddenly understood, I was being circled. Every step I took seemed mirrored, every pause answered by silence that was too complete, too intentional. My heart hammered as I tried to move cautiously, scanning for the faintest signs of life, but I couldn't see more than glimpses, slender forms, hunched low, eyes glinting in the half-light that filtered through the canopy. I tried to leave, but the trail didn't behave like I expected. Roots seemed to snag my boots more often, branches reached out where they never had before, and the hollow seemed to draw me closer despite my attempts to backtrack. My stomach churned as the feeling of dozens of unseen eyes pressed in from every angle. Every crack of a branch underfoot sounded amplified, like a gunshot in the stillness, and every small rustle in the underbrush made me jerk my head around, expecting, fearing what I couldn't name. My pulse was deafening in my ears, my breath shallow and rapid, and yet the shapes never revealed themselves fully, retreating just as I thought I'd caught sight of one. Panic finally took over. I ran. My feet tore at the muddy ground, tripping over roots, sliding on damp leaves, but still I could feel them circling me. The hollow's edge blurred in the foggy light, and every glance over my shoulder made me certain there were bodies crouched among the ferns, always just beyond clarity. I could feel the way the forest bent around me, a living thing intent on keeping me inside, and I realized I had no idea which way led out. My lungs burned, legs screamed, but I couldn't stop. Stopping meant being caught in the scrutiny of those unseen watchers. Somewhere in the trees, a branch snapped sharply, and I nearly fell. The sound was close, too close, and it was accompanied by a faint, low noise I couldn't identify. Not growling, not human speech, but somewhere in between, guttural and faint, almost playful, as if whatever was there was testing me, letting me know it was aware. My mind screamed at me to flee, and finally the edge of the trees broke, and I stumbled onto a slightly more open path. I risked looking back once and saw them. Figures huddled together, barely visible in the mist, faces obscured but unblinking, staring silently. I swear they shifted slightly as if acknowledging me, then melted into the fog, leaving only emptiness. Even after I reached the main trail, the feeling of their gaze lingered. Every rustle in the wind, every snapping twig, every sway of branches against the dimming light seemed to echo the memory of their presence. I couldn't convince myself that I had imagined it. The hollow had changed that day, or perhaps I had just seen it as it truly was, a place where the forest watched, where creatures that moved on the edges of human perception lingered, patient and unseen. I walked the rest of the trail in silence, eyes scanning constantly, unable to shake the sensation that every shadow was still alive, still tracking my progress. Even now, weeks later, I replay that day in my mind. I remember the weight of the air, thick and pressing, the glint of eyes in the half-light, the subtle movements of bodies hidden just out of sight. I can still feel the cold, faint brush of something unseen against my skin, the way the hollow seemed to breathe, and the certainty that whatever lingered there was not human in the way we understand it. I avoid that trail now, especially in the late afternoon when the sun tilts and shadows stretch long. Yet, no matter how far away I walk, the memory of that day remains, a quiet, creeping dread that has left a permanent imprint. I sometimes think about returning, just to see if it was real, just to confront the forest and its hidden inhabitants. But a voice inside me warns against it. Some places in Appalachia are not meant for eyes to linger, and the hollow where they lurk is one of them, patient, silent, and waiting. I'd always loved the quiet of the Appalachian forest, the way the air smelled of pine and damp earth, the soft murmur of distant streams blending with bird calls that seemed to echo endlessly. But that morning, the quiet felt different. Wrong in a way I couldn't immediately name. I was following a familiar trail, the one that cut through dense ferns and moss-covered trees, the kind of path that usually felt like a refuge from the world. My boots pressed softly into the moist soil, my camera slung around my neck, ready for the occasional deer or fox, when I heard it, a rustling deep within a thick patch of ferns. At first, I froze, thinking maybe it was just the wind, leaves brushing against each other. But then the sound persisted, subtle but deliberate, and it didn't match the rhythm of the breeze. I called out, my voice shaking slightly, expecting a response, maybe a hiker or a lost hunter, but there was nothing. The rustling didn't stop. If anything, it grew slightly, deliberate and careful. I stepped closer, heart hammering, and that's when I saw it. A small, wiry shape hunched low among the ferns. Its movements were unnervingly quiet, unnaturally quick, and though the form seemed human, there was something twisted about the way it moved. It was deliberate, watching me, aware. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to step back, but a mixture of fear and curiosity pinned me to the spot. I crouched behind a tree, barely daring to breathe, and watched as more shapes began to emerge. They moved in silence, careful not to make a sound, bodies low to the ground, weaving through the underbrush with a strange fluidity. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks, but the figures were unmistakable. Each movement deliberate, each pause calculated, almost as if they were studying me as much as I was studying them. There was a rhythm to their movement, one that didn't feel natural, that seemed entirely purposeful. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Stray children? A group of hunters? But the posture, the speed, the fluidity, all of it suggested something else. Something that had adapted entirely to this forest. Every snap of a twig beneath my own boots, every shift of a leaf in the ferns, seemed amplified. I felt as if the forest itself had taken note of my presence and was silently communicating it to them. They paused occasionally, crouched low, eyes fixed on me, then resumed their movement with the same careful deliberation. My heart raced so fast I was sure they could hear it. I debated running, but even that decision felt dangerous. Moving too quickly might draw attention, might provoke a response I wasn't prepared to face. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed in tense silence. I barely dared to breathe. I caught glimpses of faces in shadow, features gaunt, hair tangled and wild, movements fluid and deliberate. None of it seemed aggressive, yet the presence was suffocating, a quiet awareness that I wasn't supposed to be there. The forest, usually a sanctuary, felt alive in a way I'd never known, aware, patient, observant. Each step I took toward the path's edge felt measured, as though I were being guided, or perhaps manipulated. When I finally dared to move, I inched along the path, trying to maintain some semblance of control. The rustling didn't stop. It followed me in subtle waves, the ferns parting just enough to hint at their forms. I dared not look directly, fearing that doing so would lock us in some shared acknowledgement I wasn't ready for. My pace quickened, more out of relief than courage, each footstep a cautious negotiation between staying hidden and reaching safety. Eventually, the path opened up enough for me to glimpse the road in the distance, a faint strip of gravel cutting through the trees. Relief surged through me, but it was immediate and fleeting. Even as I reached the edge of the forest, the rustling persisted, though it grew fainter, eventually fading as the safety of the road expanded before me. I didn't stop to look back until I was several yards from the treeline, and even then, all I saw were shadows, indistinct, formless, yet lingering in the corner of my vision. The memory of movement pressed firmly into my mind. I've returned to that trail since, but only on the main paths, during daylight, and never alone. Even now, the memory lingers, the wiry figures moving with deliberate precision, the way the ferns seemed to sway with unseen anticipation, the rustling that marked my presence long after I left. The forest kept its secrets that day, silent and watchful, and I learned quickly that some parts of the Appalachian woods are best left undisturbed. I had set out that morning to map a seldom-used ridge trail, one I'd only seen marked faintly on old maps, where the trees grew thick and the sunlight barely touched the ground. I'd walked the ridge countless times, but that day felt different. The air heavier, denser, like the forest itself was pressing down on me. The quiet was unnatural, too complete, broken only by the soft crunch of my boots on leaves and the distant call of a crow. I'd been moving slowly, making notes in my field journal, when I noticed them. Footprints pressed into the soft earth at the edge of the trail. At first, I thought they were deer prints, but the shape was wrong. They were too small for an adult man, too large for a child, and the spacing between steps was uneven, deliberate in a way that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. Curiosity mingled with unease, and I followed the prints. They led off the main path, winding through dense brush and overexposed roots, weaving in ways that didn't make sense if a normal animal had made them. As I moved deeper into the trees, I caught movement in the corners of my eyes. Shapes shifting between trunks and underbrush, silhouettes darting just out of reach. I froze, thinking perhaps a deer had moved, or maybe even another hiker trying to keep hidden. I called out, my voice sounding absurdly loud against the muted forest, but there was no reply. Only the rapid, hammering beat of my own heart filled the air. I continued cautiously, glancing constantly to either side, trying to make sense of the rhythm of shadows and footprints. Every time I thought I was alone, a figure would emerge ahead or behind me, vanishing the instant I tried to focus on it. They didn't make a sound, just moved with a strange, fluid motion, disappearing into the folds of the forest as if the trees themselves were swallowing them. My mind raced, wondering if I was imagining it, letting exhaustion and isolation warp reality. But the footprints under my feet, crisp and intentional, told me otherwise. They were real, deliberate, and leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed to blur. The trail grew narrower, the ridge dropping off steeply to one side, the underbrush thickening to the point where progress was slow and every footfall sounded deafening. The prints continued, always ahead, yet never reaching a final destination I could discern. At one point, I tripped over a root and fell hard into the mud. When I looked up, I saw movement again. A slender form crouched low in the shadows, then gone before I could get a proper look. The forest felt alive around me, each rustle of leaves, each snap of a twig, a signal that I was being tracked. Panic began to rise. I tried to backtrack, but the path seemed to twist unnaturally, familiar turns blending into each other until I couldn't tell left from right. Darkness began to settle, thick and suffocating, as the last rays of sun struggled through the canopy. I realized with a sinking feeling that I was lost. The prince guided me through dense brush, up and down slopes, over streams I didn't remember, until my boots were soaked and my legs ached from strain. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, felt amplified as if the forest itself were attuned to my fear. And all the while, the shadowy forms continued to watch from just out of reach. Occasionally, I thought I saw eyes glinting in the fading light, but when I focused, there was nothing. Only the persistent, deliberate footprints beneath me, as though some unknown presence wanted me to follow. Eventually, I stumbled back toward the main trail, heart hammering, lungs burning. Relief surged briefly, but it was immediate and fleeting. When I glanced down at the trail, the footprints stopped abruptly, as if they had never been there at all. The forest returned to its usual quiet, the kind I had known for years. But something had changed. My chest still heaved, my hands trembled, and every shadow seemed heavier, more deliberate. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a familiar face emerge from the trees, but there was only the dense, unyielding forest, silent and watchful. Even now, I can't shake the memory of those footprints, the uneven steps, the way they seemed almost human, almost deliberate in their pacing. I remember the fleeting shapes that danced just beyond my vision, the brush parting as if acknowledging my presence, always careful, always just out of reach. The ridge trail appears unchanged when I visit during the day, sunlight spilling through the canopy, but I know better. I've learned that some parts of the Appalachian woods are not empty, not truly silent. Some paths are marked, watched, and remembered by eyes that disappear before you can see them fully. And whenever I close my eyes at night, I can still see the prints, feel the presence circling, patient and deliberate, reminding me that I was never alone. I'd been hiking the trail for years, and the massive oak at the bend had always been my favorite rest spot. Its wide, gnarled branches stretched over the path, and its roots twisted like old hands gripping the earth. I would sit there sometimes, leaning against the trunk, watching the light shift through the leaves, listening to the quiet hum of the forest. But that day, everything felt different. From the moment I approached, the air seemed heavier, the smell of damp leaves sharper, almost metallic. The forest that usually felt welcoming seemed tense, like it was holding its breath, waiting. I shook my head, telling myself it was just a mood, just a trick of morning light filtering through the canopy. As I lowered myself to sit at the base of the oak, I heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost a growl, coming from beneath the roots. My stomach dropped, a cold weight sinking into my chest. I knelt closer, peering into the hollow between the twisted roots, and that's when I saw them. Two glowing eyes staring back at me. They were small, round, and unblinking, reflecting the dappled sunlight in an unnatural way. My body froze, a mix of fascination and fear rooting me in place. I wanted to look away, to convince myself it was a trick of shadow and moss, but I couldn't. The eyes held me there, a silent command I didn't want to obey. Then a shape moved. Just inside the hollow, hunched low, the figure's outline nearly blending with the roots. It was human-shaped, but wrong somehow. The posture was rigid, calculated, yet the movement was almost feline in its silence. I stumbled backward instinctively, tripping over exposed roots, my camera clattering to the ground. When I glanced back, the figure was gone, vanished without a sound, as if it had never existed. My hands shook as I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering in my chest. The forest around the oak felt different now. The usual whispers of wind through the leaves were gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness. I stayed long enough to feel the weight of it pressing down, the kind of quiet that feels almost sentient. Every shadow seemed heavier, every rustle sharper. I could feel eyes on me, though I knew I was alone, or so I told myself. My rational mind argued that it had been a stray animal, maybe a raccoon or fox, but the memory of the glowing eyes, the deliberate movement, refused to be dismissed. I backed away slowly, keeping the oak in sight, and noticed details I'd never seen before. The hollow between the roots was deeper than I remembered, the soil disturbed as if something, or someone, had been living there, hidden from view. My imagination raced, and yet a part of me remained convinced it wasn't imagination at all. The forest had a rhythm that day, one that pulsed with life beyond what I understood, and I had been intruding. The trail ahead was familiar, but I moved cautiously, constantly glancing back. Each step felt measured, careful, like I was negotiating my presence with the unseen watcher beneath the oak. The usual sounds of birds and insects seemed muted, replaced by the echo of my own heartbeat in the hollow air. I kept expecting movement, some sign that the figure had not disappeared entirely, but the forest remained still, patient. By the time I reached a bend in the trail where sunlight finally broke through the canopy, my pulse had begun to slow, though my hands still trembled. The oak loomed behind me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching, that the hollow beneath its roots had secrets it had kept for decades, secrets that had been disturbed only by my presence. I glanced back one last time and thought I saw the faintest outline in the root system, just for a second, but it was gone before I could be sure. Even now, the memory lingers. I can close my eyes and see the glowing eyes peering from the hollow, feel the oppressive stillness wrapping around me, hear the low guttural sound echoing faintly in the mind. I avoid that section of the trail whenever I hike alone, though I've returned with companions, daylight blazing down, to reassure myself it was nothing. But the oak has its own way of keeping secrets, and I know, deep down, that whatever lurks beneath those roots has been there long before me and will remain long after. The forest is patient. So am I now in my avoidance, remembering that some places are best left undisturbed, their stories whispered only in rustling leaves and fleeting shadows. I'd been hiking alone that evening, following a trail that wound along the side of a ridge, where the forest opened onto sweeping views of the valley below. The sun was sinking low, spilling a blood-orange light across the peaks, and the air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. I liked these hours when the forest was quiet and the world felt suspended, removed from the rush of everything else. But then it happened, a scream sharp and piercing echoing through the valley. It wasn't close, but it carried unnaturally far, bouncing off the hills and twisting through the trees in a way that made my stomach knot. My first instinct was to run toward it. Someone might be hurt, or worse, and I couldn't ignore it. But as I pressed on, I found the forest empty. No signs of struggle, no figure lying in the brush, nothing but the uneven trail winding up the ridge and the last of the sun slipping behind distant peaks. I called out, my voice swallowed immediately by the thick air, and the scream returned. Closer this time, yet somehow still hollow, as if the valley itself were shaping it, amplifying the terror. There was a strange cadence to it, part human, part something else, and I felt the hairs on my arms bristle. I tried to keep my focus on the trail, scanning the periphery for any movement. Shadows shifted unnaturally at the edges of my vision, slender figures retreating just beyond my line of sight. I stopped to listen, straining, hoping my imagination was exaggerating, but the forest stayed silent except for that scream. It was impossible to tell where it came from. Each time I took a step forward, it seemed to come closer, then recede, echoing as though the woods themselves were playing tricks on me. As night fell, the forest grew denser. The last traces of sunlight disappeared, replaced by a deep indigo that pooled between the trunks. The stars emerged overhead, but the forest beneath was a shadowed maze. I could no longer rely on sight alone. Every sound was magnified, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the sigh of wind through the pines, the distant hoot of an owl, but always beneath it that scream pulsed. Closer now, more deliberate, almost testing me, measuring my response. I wanted to run, but fear made my limbs stiff, each step careful, calculated. Then I glimpsed movement. A shape darted between the trees, low to the ground, retreating before I could focus. Another followed, and another. Each one disappeared as if it had never existed, leaving only the lingering sense of being watched. I realized with a sinking dread that the scream wasn't just noise. It was a lure, pulling me deeper, guiding me through the shadows, insisting I follow. My heart hammered with every step, my lungs burning, but I couldn't turn back. The The trail behind me had vanished in darkness, the familiar markers swallowed by night. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed in tense silence punctuated by the scream. Sometimes it faded into the distance, teasing me with a false sense of relief, only to return closer and more hollow. I stumbled through underbrush, tripping over roots and rocks, feeling the eyes of something unseen tracking my progress. The figures that appeared in the periphery never stayed long enough to confirm their presence fully. They were shadows of movement, silhouettes against the blackened forest, slipping away before I could understand what they were. Finally, I stumbled into a small clearing. The stars hung above like distant lanterns, cold and indifferent, and the forest opened slightly, giving me space to breathe. For the first time in hours, the screaming stopped. Silence replaced it, heavy and almost unnatural, pressing against my ears, making me hyper-aware of every heartbeat. I sank to the ground, chest heaving, eyes scanning the forest line. Nothing moved. The shadows were gone. The forest seemed ordinary again, yet the feeling of being watched lingered, a quiet insistence that I was not alone, and perhaps had never been. Even now, I replay that night in my mind, the scream echoing across the valley, the hollow human-like cadence, the fleeting shapes that vanished before recognition. I can still feel the pull, the sense that the forest wanted me to believe, to follow, and the dread that comes from knowing some things are not meant to be understood. I never found another hiker, never saw anyone in the valley, and yet the memory of that scream, and the shadows that accompanied it, has stayed with me. I returned to that ridge during the day once to reassure myself, to test whether it had all been my imagination, and the forest seemed innocent enough. Sunlight poured between the trees, the air smelled of pine and moss, and the trail was quiet except for the normal creaks and rustles of life. But I know better. That scream, hollow and deliberate, was real, or at least real enough for the forest to shape its echo, to guide me through its shadows. And though I tell myself it was a fluke, a trick of light and sound, deep down I feel the memory waiting, persistent, in the folds of every Appalachian forest I enter, reminding me that some nights leave marks you can never fully shake. I set out that morning just as the sun was brushing the peaks with gold, eager to explore a trail I'd never walked before. On the map, it was barely marked, a thin, almost forgotten line snaking through dense woods along the side of a ridge. At first, it was serene. The trees arched overhead, casting dappled light across the soft soil. Birds called lazily from high branches, and the wind whispered through leaves in a familiar, comforting rhythm. It felt like the kind of place you could wander all day and still feel at home, removed from the world and its noise. I hiked slowly, taking notes and snapping pictures, letting the forest settle around me, letting myself breathe. That calm didn't last long. It started subtly, with small things I barely noticed at first. A twig snapped just ahead of me, sharp in the quiet, and I glanced up, half expecting a hiker or a deer. There was nothing, just the trail stretching forward, empty and peaceful, or so I thought. Then I saw the pattern. Broken twigs, footprints pressed into the soft earth, small, deliberate, leading forward. I leaned closer, noting the shapes. They weren't quite human, not quite animal. Somewhere in between. I shook my head, telling myself it was my imagination, and pressed on. But the trail began to mirror me. Every time I turned, I noticed the same prints behind me, as if whatever made them had followed. Branches snapped faintly in the underbrush, soft, deliberate sounds that seemed to respond to my movements. I froze several times, scanning the edges of the trees, and there they were, shapes crouched low, retreating just out of sight whenever I tried to get a proper look. The forest had shifted. What had once been a familiar, welcoming path now felt like a corridor of eyes and unseen watchers. Panic began to creep in. My pace quickened, my steps loud against the underbrush, but the trail never lost its uncanny rhythm. Twigs cracked ahead and behind. Shadows shifted with a subtle awareness I couldn't explain. I ran, heart hammering, lungs burning, but still the feeling followed me. The sense that I was never alone, that every movement I made was observed and mirrored. It wasn't fear of attack exactly, but a creeping dread, the kind that burrows into your chest and refuses to leave, insisting that something is tracking you even if you can't see it. Hours, or maybe minutes, time warped in that strange section of the forest, passed in tense, agonizing motion. My eyes darted to every shadow, every flicker of movement, but the figures never revealed themselves fully. They stayed at the edges, crouched low, slipping between tree trunks, moving with a silent precision that made my blood run cold. Every step I took seemed guided, measured, as though the trail itself had taken on a consciousness, responding to my presence, holding me in its gaze. Eventually, I stumbled into a patch of moonlight that spilled through a break in the canopy. The main road was just beyond, and I ran toward it, the forest pressing down around me like a living thing. When I emerged, the world felt normal again, the kind of relief that should have allowed me to breathe. But it didn't. The feeling of unseen eyes never left me. Even on the road, with headlights streaking through the darkness, my skin prickled with awareness, and every shadow along the tree lane seemed alive. Even now, weeks later, I replay that walk in my mind. I can feel the forest's weight, hear the faint snap of twigs, see the crouched shapes just beyond the edge of vision. The trail watched me, mirrored me, and I know it still does, waiting for the next person curious enough or foolish enough to wander its length. Some paths in the Appalachians aren't meant to be walked, at least not alone, and that forgotten trail is one of them, patient, silent, and always aware. I remember that day clearly, the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns that made the trees seem alive, as if they were breathing. I had been following a narrow trail that wound along a ridge, the undergrowth thick and the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. The creek crossing came into view just as the sun was high enough to make the water glint, shallow and deceptively calm. I stepped carefully onto the stones, testing each one before putting my weight down. When I thought I saw it, a figure crouched among the rocks, eyes fixed on me. My pulse spiked instantly, a cold rush of adrenaline mixing with disbelief. I froze, heart hammering, unsure if my mind was playing tricks, if the morning light had created shadows that could look so distinctly like a face. The figure didn't move immediately. It remained low, hunched, silent, a shadow among shadows. Then I noticed them. Dozens of small shapes emerging from the undergrowth, crouched low, careful, deliberate. Each one watched me, eyes glinting briefly in the filtered sunlight, reflecting just enough to make me certain I wasn't imagining it. My instincts screamed at me to move, to retreat, but as I shifted my weight, I realized something chilling. No matter which way I turned, which stone I stepped on, they adjusted. The figures circled silently, always appearing just where I thought I might escape. The creek, which had seemed a safe, shallow crossing, became a trap, and the forest around me felt suddenly alive in a way I had never experienced before. I tried to backtrack slowly, putting each footstep down with care, listening to the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But the shapes mirrored me, keeping pace, circling in a rhythm that was unervingly intelligent. It wasn't like being stalked by a predator. There was no growl, no rush, but there was the certainty of intent, an awareness that pressed on me from every side. I could feel it in the air, in the subtle shift of branches, in the way the light caught the edges of those crouched forms. My skin prickled, and a cold sweat ran down my back as I realized the creek crossing, which I had thought would be a mere obstacle, had become a threshold I might never have left without being seen. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My eyes darted constantly, trying to pin one figure in focus, but each attempt failed. They were careful, fluid, almost feline in their motion, slipping between the brush and stones with a precision that was almost impossible. Every time I dared to glance over my shoulder, a new shape had appeared, crouched silently among ferns or rocks, watching, waiting. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with tension, as though the forest had conspired to trap me in that narrow crossing. I considered calling out, my voice trembling, but the thought of drawing attention froze my tongue. Silence felt safer, though the weight of their gaze was almost unbearable. Eventually, I found a faint trail leading away from the creek, barely discernible beneath moss and fallen leaves. I moved toward it, slow at first, then faster as courage, or desperation, took hold. The shapes didn't follow me beyond the water, retreating silently into shadows, melting into the undergrowth as if they had never been there. I didn't dare glance back, not until I was several yards onto the trail, and even then I could feel it, the lingering sense that unseen eyes were still tracking, still remembering. Even now, I replay that crossing in my mind. The cold rush of the creek water, the shifting shadows, the deliberate, almost human-like forms that emerged from the ferns and rocks, they are burned into my memory. The forest, which I had walked countless times before without fear, became a living, watching entity that day. I have returned to that area during bright hours with companions, hoping to dispel the memory, but the forest remains unchanged, serene on the surface, yet hiding secrets just beyond the edge of perception. I still feel it when I hike alone, the sense of being observed, of my movements mirrored, the quiet certainty that the woods remember every step, every misstep. The creek crossing, once a simple path through the Appalachians, became something else for me, a threshold between the ordinary and the uncanny, a place where the forest itself seemed to hold its breath, and where I understood for the first time that being seen does not always require eyes that we can perceive. The shapes may never have existed, or perhaps they always have, but the fear, the awareness, the oppressive knowledge of being tracked remains. I remember stumbling across the cabin on a late afternoon hike, the sun low enough to cast long, trembling shadows across the forest floor. I'd been following an unmarked trail, one that wound through dense underbrush and old-growth trees, curious about what I might find in a section of the woods I'd never explored before. I had my pack on, my camera slung over my shoulder, and the familiar weight of solitude settling around me like a cloak. At first, the cabin looked like just another ruin, a forgotten structure half swallowed by vines and moss, its roof sagging and boards warped by decades of rain and snow. But there was something in its presence that immediately made me uneasy, an energy that seemed older, more deliberate than simple decay. As I stepped closer, the scent hit me first, damp earth, rot, and something else I couldn't place, sharp and pungent. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and as I pushed it open, the air inside shifted, colder than outside, still oppressive. The interior was small, dimly lit by the fading sunlight spilling through gaps in the walls. Scraps of fabric, torn and stained, were scattered across the floor. I noticed crude carvings etched into the wood beams, lines that suggested shapes, faces maybe, but distorted and uneven. My stomach tightened. Then I saw the footprints. Small, irregular, almost human in shape, but not quite. They crossed the floor, pressed into dust and dirt, and led toward the far corner of the cabin before fading into darkness. I wasn't alone, I realized, and a shiver ran down my spine. Every movement I made seemed amplified. My boots creaked on the floorboards, each sound bouncing off the walls like an accusation. I felt watched, a constant pressure on my back, though there was nothing visible in the shadows. I moved slowly, careful not to touch anything, my camera ready, but my hand shook. The cabin had a way of absorbing my attention, drawing me into its corners, and every glance revealed more. Marks in the wood that hadn't been there when I first looked, faint scratches that might have been from claws or fingernails, a darkened patch on the floor that suggested recent moisture, as if someone, or something, had just stepped there. I tried to convince myself it was empty, that I was letting my imagination run wild in the oppressive quiet. But then a sound. Soft, deliberate, like a foot sliding across the floor behind me, though when I spun around, there was nothing. I froze, listening, the hairs on my neck standing on end. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift subtly, a motion barely perceptible, yet unmistakable. I moved toward the door again, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing down, heavy with expectation. It was as if the cabin itself was aware of me, cataloging my fear, weighing my attention, and deciding silently whether to allow me to leave. I didn't linger. Every step toward the door felt like it was measured by unseen eyes, every creak of the floorboard a test. When I finally stepped out into the fading light, I felt the forest's normal hush return, but the cabin remained. Its broken windows and sagging roof seemed almost sentient, a quiet presence that had observed me, studied me, and let me go, but only to haunt me afterward. I didn't look back, but even as I walked away, I could feel its gaze, a lingering awareness that settled into my mind and refused to leave. That night, in my tent miles from the cabin, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those small footprints, the distorted carvings, the way the shadows had moved just out of the corner of my eye. Every creak in the forest outside my tent sounded like floorboards, every rustle of leaves like someone, or something, moving just beyond reach. I questioned my own senses, tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had been an old animal den, perhaps a hermit's cabin long abandoned. But deep down, I knew it had been more than that. The cabin had recognized me in a way that no mere structure could, and the memory of that recognition stayed with me, pressing against the edges of sleep and daylight alike. Even months later, the thought of that place brings a tightness in my chest. I have returned to the trail once or twice, daylight blazing down through the canopy, hoping to reassure myself that the cabin was simply an old ruin, harmless and inert. But it has disappeared from the maps, and I can never find the exact spot again. I sometimes wonder if it was never really there, if it was a living memory of the forest itself, manifesting just long enough to observe me, to leave its mark on my mind. And still, when I close my eyes at night, I see it. The hollow doorway, the crooked roof, the faint shimmer of eyes, or perhaps reflections of light, watching me from within, always patient, always waiting. I had been hiking that ridge trail countless times, or so I thought, but that day it felt different. The path narrowed as it approached the spine of rock that jutted over the valley, the drop steep and sudden, the wind cutting across the ledge with a sharp, biting edge. The forest behind me had been quiet, the usual hum of birds and insects muted, replaced by a stillness that made each footstep seem louder, more deliberate. As I stepped onto the exposed ridge, the familiar view of the valley below was obscured by shadows that shifted unnaturally along the cliffside. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving the brush, the fading light playing tricks. But then the shapes formed, human-like, crouched, darting just out of reach whenever I tried to focus on them. I called out, my voice cracking slightly in the thin air, but no answer came. Only movement. Quick, deliberate, watching. My stomach tightened, and a cold sweat prickled along my spine. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, yet curiosity, and perhaps some stubborn pride, kept me moving forward. I felt it then, the awareness of eyes on me from every angle, the sense that each step I took along the ridge was observed, noted, catalogued by something that had been there long before I arrived. I wasn't just on the trail. I was being measured, my presence marked, every motion recorded in silence. The shadows seemed to stretch and bend with the rocks, slipping between boulders and outcroppings with an ease that felt unnatural. When I tried to pinpoint them, they moved faster than my eyes could track, vanishing and reappearing in the periphery of my vision. My hands shook as I gripped my walking stick tighter, scanning every crevice, every fold of the cliffside. The wind whistled past, carrying faint, unintelligible sounds, breath, whispering. That made the hairs on my arms stand on end. It wasn't fear of being attacked exactly. It was the kind of dread that burrows into your chest, the sense that you are trespassing somewhere older, deeper, and utterly indifferent to your existence. I tried to quicken my pace, moving carefully but deliberately along the ridge, keeping a wide berth from the edge. Every step felt mirrored by the shadows, and I could sense them shifting with me, anticipating my path. The rocks beneath my boots were slick with dew, each footfall precarious, and I caught myself glancing over the edge, half expecting to see the shapes reflected in the valley below. But there was nothing, only the forest and the fading light. Yet the feeling remained. Unseen watchers crouched just beyond reach, patient, silent, their presence pressing down in a weight that made it hard to breathe. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I moved along the spine, and the shadows never relented. They shifted subtly, always maintaining the same distance from me, always just out of clear view. My pulse raced, every nerve alert, and the air itself seemed charged, thick with something ancient, deliberate, and knowing. I stumbled over a loose stone and froze, afraid that any sudden movement would betray me, that the watchers would close in, though I didn't know what that meant exactly. I realized then that the ridge was alive in a way I had never felt before, a living edge, holding memory and motion in the folds of its stone, populated by beings, or echoes, that had observed countless travelers before me. When I finally reached a section where the trail widened slightly, allowing me more space from the cliff's edge, the shadows pulled back into the folds of rock, dissolving into darkness. My heart was still hammering, my lungs burning from exertion, but the sense of being tracked lingered. Every tree and boulder seemed like it might conceal another watcher, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the ridge itself had marked me, catalogued me, and would carry the memory of my presence long after I was gone. Even now, months later, I can close my eyes and see the shifting silhouettes, feel the weight of their gaze on me, the ridge alive with observation. The memory presses against me like the wind that cuts along that narrow spine, sharp, insistent, inescapable. I have returned to the area during daylight, seeking reassurance, but the trail seems ordinary, peaceful, almost indifferent. Yet I know better. That ridge is patient, silent, holding its watchers in waiting, and some part of me knows that it remembers, still, who walked its spine and felt its eyes. I remember stepping into that pine grove on a late morning, the air heavy with the scent of resin and damp earth. The forest was quiet, the kind of silence that makes every small sound seem amplified, every footstep like a drumbeat against the soft floor of needles. At first, it felt peaceful, almost meditative, as if I had stumbled into a place untouched by time. But there was something off, something that didn't settle right in my chest. The silence wasn't natural. It was deliberate, oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. As I walked, I noticed subtle signs that told me I wasn't alone. Broken branches lay scattered in odd patterns. Shallow depressions marred the ground as though someone, or something, had been crouching there recently, and a faint, sour odor of earth and sweat hung in the air. My skin prickled, and I slowed my pace, scanning the shadows between the trees. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling, careful and deliberate, the kind of sound that seemed meant to signal awareness without drawing attention. My heart started to hammer, but I tried to steady my breath, telling myself it might be a deer, a squirrel, something ordinary. Then I saw them. Shadows crouched low behind the trunks, barely visible in the filtered light, yet undeniably present. They didn't move like animals, not quite, but neither did they move like humans. They were deliberate, careful, always keeping their distance, always watching. I froze, instinct screaming at me to flee, but curiosity, or perhaps disbelief, kept me rooted. The longer I stared, the more I realized the silence of the grove was not empty. It was full, heavy with intent, charged with the presence of unseen watchers. Every small snap of a branch, every whisper of movement, seemed to punctuate that silence like a deliberate heartbeat. Panic began to rise, tight and suffocating. My eyes darted constantly, trying to track each shadow, each subtle movement, but they slipped between the trees with a precision that made me question my own perception. I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach drop, that I was being measured, my presence catalogued. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to put distance between myself and the grove, but even the path I thought I knew seemed to twist subtly under their gaze. The trees themselves felt alive, leaning just enough to obscure, reveal, and guide my steps. Finally, I ran. My boots tore through the pine needles, branches snagged at my jacket, and my lungs burned with each desperate intake of air. I didn't look back, afraid that even a single glance would draw their attention, make them move in a way I could not anticipate. The rustling followed me at first, faint but persistent, like the forest itself was breathing around me, urging me to flee faster, to never pause. I stumbled over roots, skidding down a small embankment, but the grove didn't release its hold until I had cleared the last of the trees and emerged onto the main trail. Even then, the sense of being watched lingered. Every shadow in the forest edge seemed heavier. Every sway of branches suggested eyes just beyond sight. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the crouched forms emerge once again, but there was nothing. The forest seemed normal, quiet in the ordinary way of trees, but I knew better. That grove had catalogued me, marked me, and its memory, like a predator's patience, would follow me. Weeks later, the image of those shadows, crouched, careful, deliberate, haunted me. Even in my dreams, the silence of the grove presses against me, punctuated by soft rustles and fleeting movements at the edges of my vision. I have returned to pine groves before, hoping to reassure myself, to test whether it was a trick of the light or my imagination, but that grove remains unique in memory. A place where the silence was alive, and the watchers, hidden and patient, remained forever present, lingering long after I left.